In a world where the hours felt like heavy stones and the minutes were sharp shards of glass, there lived a man named Julian, whose heart had become a frozen wasteland after a loss so profound that the very sun seemed to lose its warmth. The mental pain he carried was not a single blow, but a continuous, crushing weight that made every morning feel like a battlefield and every night a descent into a cold, dark well of memories. He believed that some wounds were too deep for any balm, and that some shadows were too long for any light to reach. So he retreated into a cabin at the edge of the eternal forest, a place where the trees were said to breathe slower than the rest of the world. For Julian, the pain was a physical presence, a knot in his throat that never loosened and a coldness in his chest that no fire could melt. He sat on his porch, watching the seasons change, but he felt nothing, convinced that he was a ghost trapped in a living body, waiting for a clock that had stopped long ago. He cursed the sun for rising and the stars for shining, for he felt it was an insult that the world continued to turn while his own universe had shattered into a million silent pieces. He was a man who had forgotten how to breathe without the scent of grief, and he believed that time was merely a cruel joke that stretched out his suffering like a thin, unbreakable wire. However, the eternal forest had a rhythm of its own, a slow and ancient pulse that didn't care for the frantic ticking of human clocks. One winter, Julian found a sapling that had been crushed by a fallen oak. Its trunk snapped and its leaves buried in the ice. He felt a strange kinship with the broken tree and, without knowing why, he cleared the heavy wood and wrapped the sapling in burlap to shield it from the wind. He didn't expect it to live. He simply wanted it to have a quiet place to wither. But as the weeks bled into months, the forest began to whisper its secret. That time is not a line, but a circle, and that every winter is secretly preparing for a spring it cannot yet see. The transformation was so slow it was invisible to the naked eye, but Julian began to notice that the ice was no longer a wall, but a blanket. He watched as the sapling didn't just heal, but grew a knot of thick, strong bark over its wound, a scar that became its strongest point. He realized that the time he had spent watching the tree was time he had unspent drowning in his own shadow. The mental pain didn't vanish in a single moment of clarity. Instead, it eroded like a mountain under a steady rain, piece by microscopic piece, until the sharp edges were rounded and the heavy weight became a part of his own strength. The emotional breakthrough came on a morning when the first green bud appeared on the scarred sapling. Julian touched the tiny leaf and felt a spark of warmth in his own chest, a sensation so foreign he almost wept. He understood then that time is the greatest physician because it doesn't just heal the wound, changes the person who carries it. He realized that the version of him that had been broken was gone, and the version of him that remained was something new, something forged in the furnace of his own endurance. He began to see his memories, not as knives, but as the roots that allowed him to stand so firmly in the present, a powerful realization that his pain was the price of a love that was still real, even in the silence. The unique power of this healing was that it didn't require Julian to forget, but to integrate. He returned to the world not as the man he was before, but as a man who knew the secret of the forest, that nothing is ever truly lost, it only changes form. The happy ending arrived when Julian opened his cabin door to others who were lost in their own winters, offering them a seat on his porch and the gift of his own silence. He had become a living testament to the truth that time is a medicine that requires no prescription other than the courage to keep breathing until the light returns. As the sun set in a glorious explosion of orange and violet, Julian sat in the stillness, finally at peace with the ticking of the clock. The pain was no longer a cage, but a quiet companion that reminded him he was alive. And as he drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, the forest breathed with him a steady and eternal rhythm that promised that tomorrow would be exactly what it needed to be. The silence of the eternal forest was no longer a void for Julian, but a conversation where every rustle of the wind told him that the earth was constantly renewing itself, even in the darkest hours of the night. He began to spend his days tending to the other forgotten corners of the woods, finding broken branches and shielding them, or clearing the path for the smallest flowers to reach the light. And with every act of care for the world outside, he was secretly stitching together the torn pieces of his own spirit. He realized that the time he had once feared was now his most loyal companion, because it didn't rush him to feel better or demand that he be fixed, but instead it allowed him the space to simply exist until his soul was ready to bloom again. The mental pain that had once been a jagged mountain peak now looked like a distant hill in the rearview mirror of his mind, and though he could still see it, he was no longer standing in its shadow. One afternoon he found an old photograph at the bottom of a dusty drawer, a memory from the time before the lozenge instead of the usual sharp sting of agony. He felt a warm glow of gratitude that he had been lucky enough to have something so beautiful to lose in the first place. This shift in perspective was the most powerful medicine of all, because it turned his grief into a treasure and his tears into a tribute to a love that would never truly die. Julian's cabin soon became a beacon for those who were lost in their own winters of the Sola's word. Spread of the man who lived at the edge of the forest and knew the secret language of time. People would come to him with eyes full of the same cold flint he once had, and he would simply point to the scarred tree and tell them that the strongest wood grows over the deepest wounds. He didn't offer them quick fixes or empty platitudes, but he gave them the gift of his presence and the quiet assurance that the sun would eventually find them too, if they only stayed still enough to be found. The unique strength of Julian's happy ending was that it was quiet and solid like the roots of the ancient oaks around him, and he found that his capacity for joy had actually grown larger because it was built on a foundation of survived sorrow. As the seasons continued their slow and beautiful dance, he found himself looking forward to the future not with fear, but with a curious heart, wondering what new colors the time would paint upon his life. The weight in his chest had been replaced by a deep and resonant peace that hummed in tune with the breathing of the forest, and he realized that the medicine of time had not just healed his pain, but had made him more human than he had ever been. As the moon rose to watch over the quiet cabin, Julian lay in his bed listening to the steady ticking of a heart that was no longer frozen but beating with the rhythm of 1,000 springs. He felt a profound sense of connection to every living thing that had ever struggled and survived, and he knew that he was finally part of the grand slow motion of the universe once more. The story of the man who thought he was broken had become a story of the man who was made whole by the passing hours. And as he drifted into the soft embrace of sleep, he whispered a thank you to the time that had carried him through the dark and into the light of a new and beautiful dawn. The seasons began to blur together into a seamless tapestry of healing, where the memory of the sharp frost no longer brought fear, but a quiet respect for the rest it had provided. Julian found that the medicine of time had not only mended his own spirit, but had granted him a rare kind of sight. He could now see the hidden potential in the most broken things around him. He spent his quiet afternoons walking deep into the parts of the forest that others avoided, where the shadows were thickest, and he would plant seeds in the dark soil, knowing that time would do the work that his hands could not. He understood that the most powerful changes in life are those that happen in the silence, when no one is watching and when the heart finally stops fighting against the flow of the hours. The mental pain that had once felt like a solid wall had now become like a thin mist that the morning sun easily reached through, and Julian realized that his heart was not a fragile vessel that had been shattered, but a resilient river that had simply been dammed for a while. As the water finally broke through the debris, it flowed faster and clearer than ever before, carrying the wisdom of the stones it had passed over. He sat by the stream and watched the fallen leaves spin in the current, letting the beauty of the temporary nature of life fill him with a sense of profound grace. He was no longer a man waiting for the end, but a man who had discovered that every moment was a beginning if he was brave enough to let the previous one go. The unique power of his journey reached its peak when he realized that he no longer needed to look at the clock to know he was okay, because the rhythm of his own breathing had become his guide. He had learned the ultimate lesson that time does not just pass. It teaches, it transforms, and it ultimately transcends the very pain it once seemed to prolong. The cabin at the edge of the forest was now a place of light and warmth, where the air was always filled with the scent of pine and the sound of a spirit at peace. Julian had become a bridge between the world of sorrow and the world of hope, showing everyone who crossed his path that the medicine of time is always working, even when we feel the most forgotten. The happy ending was a golden horizon that stretched out before him, endless and inviting, and as the sun dipped low and the stars began to hum their ancient lullaby, Julian felt a deep and absolute connection to the eternal pulse of existence. He was whole, he was healed, and he was finally home in his own skin. The story of the medicine of time was now written in every line of his face and every beat of his heart. And as he closed his eyes for the final time that night, he did so with the smile of a man who knew that the dawn would always find him. The golden light of the dawn did not just touch the windows of the cabin, but seemed to permeate the very wood and stone, as if the house itself had learned to breathe alongside Julian. He realized that the medicine of time had performed its greatest miracle not by making him forget the past, but by making him large enough to hold both his sorrow and his joy without breaking. He began to see his life not as a collection of broken pieces, but as a beautiful mosaic where the cracks were filled with gold, making the entire picture more valuable and more complex than it would have been if it had never been hurt. The mental pain was now like a distant echo in a vast canyon, a sound that reminded him of where he had been, but no longer dictated where he was going. In the soft indigo hours of the evening, Julian would sit on his porch and feel the heartbeat of the world beneath his feet, knowing that every living thing was part of the same slow and perfect healing process. He watched the stars and understood that their light had traveled through millions of years of darkness just to reach his eyes, and he felt a profound sense of gratitude for the patience of the universe. He was no longer a man afraid of the ticking clock, because he knew that every second was a gift and every minute was a chance to witness the beauty of the transformation. His presence had become so calm and so grounded that even the wild animals of the forest would come to sit near him, sensing that they were in the company of someone who had truly mastered the art of being still. The unique power of his journey was that it ended not in a loud celebration but in a deep and resonant silence that felt like the bottom of a peaceful ocean. He had become the living embodiment of the truth that time is the great physician that heals by addition, adding layers of strength and wisdom until the original wound is just a small part of a much larger story. The happy ending was a quiet flame that burned steadily in his chest, a light that would never go out because it was fueled by the very time that had once tried to extinguish it. As the night air grew cool and the forest animals settled into their burrows, Julian leaned back in his chair and felt the ultimate release of a soul that has finally set down its heavy burden. He looked up at the moon and whispered a final blessing to the world, knowing that he was safe, he was loved, and he was whole. The medicine of time had finished its work, and as he closed his eyes to the rhythmic whispering of the trees, he drifted into a sleep so deep and so beautiful that it felt like he was being carried by the very arms of eternity. The final piece of Julian-esque journey settled over the eternal forest like a soft falling curtain of velvet starlight as the last of the heavy anchors were finally lifted from his heart, and he found himself floating in a sea of absolute quiet. The medicine of time had completed its slow and invisible surgery, leaving no scars of pain but only tracks of wisdom that shimmered like silver threads in the fabric of his soul. Every heartbeat was now a gentle affirmation of life, and every breath was a rhythmic song of gratitude that echoed through the silent rooms of the cabin and out into the vast protective darkness of the trees. The mental pain that had once been a wall was now a doorway, and as Julian stepped through it, he found a version of himself that was unbreakable because he had already been broken and put back together by the steady hands of the hours. He looked at the scarred tree one last time and saw not a victim of the storm, but a king of the forest standing tall and proud, and he realized that he too had become a monument to the power of endurance. The happy ending was not a place he had reached, but a state of being he had become, where the past was a friend, and the future was a promise, and the present was a perfect gift. As the amber glow of the final candle flickered out, the room was filled with a warm and living shadow that felt like the embrace of an old friend who had traveled a long way to find him. Julian lay his head upon the pillow and felt the heavy, comforting weight of a sleep that was no longer an escape, but a celebration of a day well lived. The story of the man and the medicine of time had reached its final page, and as the forest breathed its last lullaby for the night, the silence became a masterpiece of peace. He was safe, he was whole, and he was finally and truly home in the cradle of the stars, where the ticking of the clock is just the heartbeat of a world in love with the dawn. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of your night. May you find deep peace and restful sleep. Wishing you the sweetest dreams. If you liked it, please like, comment, and subscribe. Bye.